I'm just going to jump in here for 1 second to remind you to download the Grapple Arts BJJ Master app. The app's free to download. That's what it looks like when you open it up. There are tons of modules. Each of these has got sub-modules, and the first three techniques of every module are free. So if you ever want to check out a Grapple Arts instructional, or you ever just want to learn more, there's a ton of free material in there, and including an entirely free entire module on weak side back attacks. The weak side is becoming the strong side of the back attack meta. So you can check that out if you go either to the Play Store or to the Apple App Store and look for the Grapple Arts BJJ Master app. Free to download, free to check out. Tons of great information. Mr. Ramsey Dewey, it's been a long time that I've been following your work, and it's the first time ever chatting with you. I'm really excited about it. So, just to get geography right, you're currently in Shanghai, but you were born in Idaho. So, you're bringing
Correct.
MMA, martial arts, back to the home of martial arts. How did you do this
Okay.
reverse importation of martial arts into China?
Yeah, well, we could go back to the Chinese Cultural Revolution if you want to go back that far,
Sure.
but I don't know if we really need to. We often tend to think China is the birthplace of martial arts, or at least the traditional martial arts we're familiar with, the Asian ones, the progenitor of kung fu styles, karate, etc. But as soon as I got to China, I quickly realized martial arts is kind of a niche thing here. It's a very niche thing. It's very difficult to find martial arts practitioners among the population. They exist. There are schools out here. Some people will say, well, I've been to China and I was a tourist training at a kung fu school for a long time there. And well, of course, you specifically went out and found that niche, right? But it's a drop in the bucket of what the population represents. So it is also extremely difficult to find a legitimate kung fu master in China of any style. Like in the 16 years
That's
I've
a
been here,
legacy of the cultural that's a legacy of the Cultural Revolution, isn't it?
yes, largely,
So
yes. So after a- after the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Wushu Federation was formed, and they were tasked with essentially making a um, a hybridized system of forms, Taolu, that were more audience friendly, essentially. So they did things like make the stances deeper, add more jumps and acrobatic tricks, and just try to make a cool looking thing that people would get excited about. And also homogenize forms rather than essentially having all these disparate styles. And I think that was kind of a reflection of communist ideology of everybody be on the same page. But ultimately, what that did is changed the meaning and the intention of forms, and now, and it's not just China, but I would say it's almost every traditional martial art. Most people who practice forms, kata, taolu, pumse, whatever you call your form, cannot teach you what those represent, what they mean. And because of that, there's just been a massive loss of knowledge throughout the years. Now, I moved to China initially to teach at a university, to teach at Shanghai Normal University. I was working in the Department of International Tourism, basically teaching students who were training to be tour guides. And I was specifically tasked with teaching them about American culture. That was my class, and basically an introduction to American culture. Kind of a sweet gig for a while. And I ran a gym back in the U.S. I was a professional fighter. I did kickboxing and mixed martial arts, and my intention was to essentially retire from mixed martial arts after I moved to China and just focus on academia for the most part. And I found myself getting sucked back in. Um, Combat addiction is a real thing. There were fights happening in China.
Mm.
There were kickboxing matches, sanda fights, K1 rules fights. After a Chinese corporation bought the
Yeah.
rights to K1 and so on, it became like the one of the bigger combat sports here, and MMA fights as well. But again, very very niche, very underground. And it was very difficult to find anybody who even knew what UFC stood for, let alone what MMA was. But I had this idea. I love mixed martial arts. I thought, I want to start a gym here because there was nothing like it, nothing like the training I was used to back home, nothing like the old gym I had. I wanted to start that again. And it was like pulling teeth trying to explain to people why they would want to participate in cage fighting. Like, but why? That's insane. That's crazy. And it is. It really is. But yeah, there wasn't a lot in Shanghai combat sports wise 16 years ago. Today we've got the second UFC Performance Institute. There are a ton of gyms. There are a lot of jiu-jitsu schools, boxing
Mhm.
gyms that weren't here before, Muay Thai gyms, etc., etc. So now Shanghai is a great place for combat sports training. So a lot has changed. Now, I didn't bring back kung fu to China or anything like that, but or did I? Let's explore that for a minute. Kung fu, it's not a martial art. It's not a fighting style. It's a Chinese word meaning essentially great skill or talent or um, an aptitude that you develop over a long time through hard work. And it can apply to martial arts. You can have gung fu in martial arts. You can have gung fu in sewing. You're a martial artist. You probably know all this. I'm speaking to the crowd here. Stefan? What was your martial arts background before jiu-jitsu?
Uh, Started in judo, then did 5 to 7 years of Hungar Kung
Hmm.
Fu, Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, Southern White Crane Kung Fu, a little bit of Tai Chi. So
Okay.
I'm reasonably well versed,
So
exposed to Choi Lei Foot. So I'm fairly well versed in those arts. But in terms of if we had China in the 1920s and 1930s versus China in the 1960s,
hmm.
obviously the Cultural Revolution happened, and uh, so my exposure to the kung fu systems was more through the Hong Kong people, right? The people who fled from China to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And so it was a kind of a glimpse of the older kung fu as opposed to the Chinese wushu, which is that, wearing fancy silks and flying all over the place and basically
Yeah.
parkour on a flat surface.
So
And
you would have been exposed to a whole different set of forms. Did
yes,
you mention Shaolin like Long Fist or anything like that? Like
yes, yes.
okay, Tung
Uh,
Twin. Okay, yeah, that's an
Not
interesting case.
only a little bit of tum toy, I think we called it,
Okay,
but it was a different system. I don't know the etymology of or the root of the Northern Shaolin that I trained in.
yeah, that's an interesting case though, because if you learn Northern Shaolin Chongquan in China today, you're learning something essentially that was developed in the mid 1950s. If you learn it from, say, an immigrant from Hong Kong or someone who fled China to Hong Kong and then like went to America pre-cultural revolution, you're learning an entirely different set of forms. Essentially, it's a different martial art.
The tum toy I learned from somebody else. So
Okay.
the still very low stances, very large reaching,
Hmm.
very large motions, consistent with what you see in my various books on Northern Shaolin, sort of
Yeah.
the northern long fist systems. But it's so interesting because I don't think the Hong Kong stuff was that much more combative
Hmm.
than Wushu. It's a little bit more combative in the sense that you're not super low down in like a super low thighs parallel to the ground horse stance all the
Hmm.
time. But it's not about, in my opinion, it's not about the form. It's not about the techniques. It's not about whether somebody can show you what a technique means, whether it's Tai Chi or whether it's, about Southern White Crane. It's about whether you train it against resistance.
Hmm.
I mean, somebody could show you all the techniques of jiu-jitsu and you could okay, Ramsey, do technique number 4, variation 5. Do technique number 12 on the list here. And you might be able to do them all. But if you've never trained them against resistance, it might help you a tiny bit, especially if you've got a previous combat training. But if you haven't trained them against resistance, basically you're getting 1% of the value of the art. So the training against resistance there were little bits and pieces of it there in the Chinese systems that I've been exposed to through Hong Kong. and there was almost none of it in the Wushu that I've seen. Is that fair? Does that
Yeah. Oh,
coincide
for
with your
sure.
experience?
For
Yeah.
sure. Again, I've met very few Kung Fu masters who actually knew how to fight. I've told this story on my YouTube channel a few times about a Tai Chi master I met who knew how to fight. And I think a lot of people misinterpreted this story to mean that he had some magic chi powers and was. Because a lot of people conflate Tai Chi with ergokinesis, the magical ability to lay your hand on someone gently and make them fly across the room. And some people will swear up and down, oh yeah, my Shifu can do this, but that has not been my experience.
Yeah.
So I met this old man in Jiangsu province. I went to train with a Sanda camp. A friend of mine trained there, and we were training with a former national Chinese Sanda champion. That's a big deal
So
in China.
that's
That's
Chinese kickboxing essentially.
yeah, Chinese kickboxing with throws and takedowns. So it's a hybrid martial art combining punching, kicking, and wrestling, but no
But
groundwork.
no groundwork. Right.
Yes, and you got to wrestle in boxing gloves, which complicates things,
Mhm.
but it makes the sport interesting and unique. So on the last day, we're up there training for like 2 weeks, three a day trainings. It's pretty cool. Um, but the last day, the coach says we are going to go train with my Tai Chi master, and I'm thinking, okay, we're going to do some of those slow motion moves the old people
Mhm.
do in the park at 7:30 in the morning. And I'm expecting just a nice, relaxing cool down. I show up. There's this man. He's 80 years old, but he's very fit. China is very different from any other country I've been to because the old people are a lot fitter than most other places on Earth, especially compared to the United States, where past a certain age you're expected to just sit down and wait to die. Old people in China tend to be very active. They're up early in the morning doing some form of physical exercise. They're doing Tai Chi, they're doing ballroom dancing, they're walking backwards and clapping their hands. And it might seem kind of
Yeah,
silly, but that old man walking backwards and clapping his hands is running laps around the guy sitting on the couch eating potato chips.
for sure. I
And
make fun of Tai Chi as well, but every time I go by the park and there are those old people with their little tinfoil swords playing the Chinese music, it's awesome.
yeah,
They're out, they're moving, they're they're working some strength, they're working coordination, they're getting social exposure. I hope when I'm 80 years old that I'm out doing Tai Chi in the park. I
yeah,
probably won't think that I'm a deadly martial artist doing that, but it's a thousand times better, as you said, than sitting on the couch. So I simultaneously mock it, and I I also respect it.
yeah. So there are the old guys who are out there doing something, but then there are the old guys who are just doing something extra. I just got back from a trip. I was traveling around China, went to Chengdu and Inner Mongolia. Just got back from there. And while I was in Chengdu, I was out by this river, and there are these old guys, like senior citizens, and they are ripped. They got six pack abs, they got muscles. They climb over this fence that's separating people from jumping in the river. They jump in the river. This is a raging river with rapids. They start just swimming against the current for like 30 minutes, and I'm watching them like, are they going to die? What is happening here? People are just walking by, like gazing casually. This is normal. They do this every day. And the old men are just taking turns, jumping into the river, swimming against the current, and then getting out. And I'm like, how do they not die, let alone do this at an advanced age? And then they get out of the river. There's a pull-up bar. They start doing calisthenics and crazy stuff. And this is normal in China. It's not unusual to see old people do these sorts of things. Anyway, so we go to this plaza. Back to my kung fu story here, the Tai Chi story, and I see this old, very fit man, and he is doing a Tai Chi form, and he sees me, and he's like, "Come here, do this." And I try to do the form. He laughs at me because I'm doing everything wrong, obviously. And he's like, "Okay, forget that, fight me." And I was using a translator at the time. The translator says, "He says fight me," and I'm like, "Oh, he doesn't mean that. He means maybe that push hands thing. That's what he means." And so I try to push him, and he throws me, boom,
Yeah.
on the ground. It's stone tiles out there. I'm like, ow, what the heck, man? And he's like, again, fight me. Like, yeah, he doesn't mean that. I'll just get an underhook on him. He won't be able to throw me or anything. So I reach for the underhook. He lets me have it. And then I don't know what he did, but boom, he throws me again. It's like judo or something. And he's like, again, this time with power, fight me. And like, okay, I try to grab him. He wrist locks me and then shoulder locks me and throws me on the floor again. I'm like, it was like Aikido almost. And then he's like, essentially, stop playing around, punch, kick, do that UFC stuff. I'm like, all right, old boy is not kidding around. And he's standing there in a parallel stance, hands down. And I start punching at him, like for real. Because, he's going hard. I'm like, okay, I'll go hard too. And he starts slipping punches like a boxer. And he moves to the inside, grabs me, tosses me on the ground. I get up, I try to kick him. He catches it, does a golf swing takedown, which I didn't know at that time. I do now. It's one of my favorite throws. Learned it from this guy. And I've been thrown like a dozen times, and I'm in just pain. My elbow is severely bruised from getting thrown on the floor. And I get up. I'm like, that wasn't real. That didn't happen. Come on, man. He's old. He's smaller than me. Tai Chi isn't real. But again, it wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't telekinesis or ergokinesis or magic or or even like the fancy punches and kicks you see in the movies or the video games. It was mostly grappling. Like this guy was a superior wrestler, a superior grappler in every way, and his economy of motion was incredible. Like in jujitsu, we always talk about various translations of jujitsu, the soft art, the gentle art, the yielding art. And this was like everything jujitsu says it is personified perfectly. And I got up and I asked this old man, how long did it take you to master Tai Chi? And he said, about 80 years. And I'm like, wait, how old are you? He says, 80 years old. I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. It takes a lifetime. Okay. That
Did
shifted
he
my
have
whole
any background in Shuijiao or in Qinna or any of the
Shuaijiao.
and did
Well, he was
any
a
of the,
Sanda coach. He he
okay.
he also this is an interesting fact. Like immediately after he kicks my butt, he says, "And I'm also a master of praying mantis kung fu." And he starts doing his praying mantis form, and then doing backflips. Like I kid you not, dude's doing backflips. And then he holds his leg up in the splits over his head to show off how flexible he is. And I'm like, okay, this guy is incredibly fit. Like people always talk about internal power because I think they're just mistranslating the phrase "nejia chuan," which is often interpreted to mean internal martial arts. I mean, literally means like inside of the home or inside of the family, which is a whole different thing. But they assume that means you use this magical spiritual power or something. But this was very physical, extremely physical. The difference being between he wasn't trying to crush me with physical might, but rather to use principles that we learn in jiu-jitsu, frames, um, pulling when the other guy pushes when the other guy pulls, simple things like that, just done very, very well. So the coolest thing about this was it's learnable. Like I learned so much just from one sparring session with this dude. And this is one of those things that pulled me back into competitive martial arts. This was like my first year here in China. When I was thinking about retiring altogether, I was like, there's so much more to learn. And sadly, I've never found another guy that good as far as Tai Chi goes. Um,
Is it
it's
fair to call him a Tai Chi master without also saying and a Sanda master and probably having trained in a bunch of other things? I I believe you, but I don't know if just training Tai Chi would give you those skills, especially with the Tai Chi training methods that most people are aware of.
Yeah, with what most people call Tai Chi, you will never learn how to fight. essentially, there's like three things that are generally taught. There's Taolu, the forms. There's Zhuanzheng, the standing meditation, moving meditation. There's Qigong, the breathing exercises,
Pushing
and
hands.
yeah, there's Tuishuo, the pushing hands. But people often they can't tell the difference between those things. They can't tell the difference between a combative form and a standing, moving meditation and a breathing exercise. And so it's it's I mean, imagine this scenario for a minute. What if freestyle wrestling was just forgotten about mostly by the general
Mhm.
population of the world, except for a few people who tried to keep the memory of freestyle wrestling alive. And so they would get together at 7:30 in the morning and put on a singlet and do some shadow wrestling in the park together. And they did this for 200 years, something like that. And over time, the actual combat application of this shadow wrestling was forgotten because they never got on
Mhm.
the mat and wrestled with each other. They just went out to the park, put on their singlets, and did their shadow wrestling movements.
And maybe if you're really advanced, you can do a two-person form where I go in and you do the pre-rehearsed sprawl. Yeah, I've used the exact same analogy. This is hilarious. It must be the dual shaved heads
Yeah.
uh, with boxing. If without sparring in boxing, if I teach you and you teach somebody and they teach somebody else, and there's not any actual pressure testing, after 3 or 4 generations, it'll maybe look vaguely like it did. Maybe you'll be able to recognize a jab, cross, and a hook, but it'll have evolved off into some crazy area that's not at all combative. So, how about this as a hypothetical?
Hmm.
Uh, you're put in charge of, I don't know, 100 people for a couple of years. You have to teach them how to fight, and you have to do Tai Chi to do it. What do
Hmm.
you change about the training? You can't add new techniques, but you're allowed to change the training method. What would that 2 year combat effectiveness Tai Chi boot camp look like?
You know, it would look a lot like a wrestling room. It really would. It would look a lot like wrestling, or submission wrestling for the most part. Um, it would end up looking probably more like Chinese folk wrestling, specifically because Tai Chi doesn't really address the ground game. I mean,
Hmm.
there are techniques to throw and pin someone while you're standing up, but again, it's basically stand up, throw the other guy on the floor, push him across the room, that sort of thing. Grab his leg, take him down. It would look like shuai jiao, Chinese jacketed folk wrestling with or without the jacket. If I
Okay.
was only using the syllabus of movement from Tai Chi.
Yeah. So, and that Chinese folk wrestling with the jacket, how similar is that to the Mongolian wrestling that you see that also has the jacket?
Okay, technique wise, it's similar. So there are two styles of book Mongolian wrestling that I know of. There are probably more, but two I'm familiar with. There's one with a leather harness and one with a cloth,
A
small
vest.
cloth jacket and short briefs that they wear. Yeah, it's just a little vest, and the techniques are similar. Like the rules are similar, but the actual execution is different. In Mongolian wrestling, for example, there are no weight classes, and this is probably the primary difference besides the equipment. Anytime you change one rule, one piece of equipment, it becomes a radically different sport. You can exploit it differently.
Hmm.
Take for example the Shuaijiao jacket. I've got three of them in my room. I don't have one at arm's reach here, but it's got short sleeves, and because it's got short sleeves, you can insert your fingers into the sleeve and then get another grip on the collar, and it gives you this hyper overpowered grip that you can't get from a judo gi or a jiu-jitsu gi. Similar to like sambo has a pleat in the shoulder, and you can get a similar
Right.
very powerful grip and throw people in some interesting unique ways. Now the leather harness from the Mongolian wrestling, it's got different grips. It feels different. It doesn't collapse in your hands like the fabric does, and so if you're not used to that, it's going to be quite a bit different. There's a
Hmm.
guy I know. lives up in Inner Mongolia, an American, and he's wrestling with a Inner Mongolian team, and they just had a. It was kind of like blood sport with grappling. So everybody shows up like in their traditional uniform. They got Shuaijiao guys and Bok guys and judo guys and jiu-jitsu guys all wearing their respective uniforms, and they're up on a platform, and they can win by either throwing the other guy on the ground or throwing them off the platform. And the Mongolian wrestlers with the leather harnesses completely dominate this event. And the explanation given was um, it was basically what I'm saying to you right now, that when you change the rules one tiny bit, like you
Mhm.
wear leather instead of fabric, the grip changes. If you're not used to that grip, you won't succeed in the sport. Even though it's subtle,
Yeah.
it's a small thing, but it makes
Yeah.
a big difference.
Uh, One of my instructors, Dan Inosanto, has made the point that a martial art is the techniques in the martial art,
Hmm?
the training equipment in the martial art, and the training methods in the martial art. And we're talking
Hmm.
here about the equipment. Uh, Judo would look very different if we were practicing it on concrete.
Hmm? For sure.
Boxing would look very different if we were wearing MMA gloves
Hmm?
versus big pillow gloves versus, I don't know, the Thai rope wrap with broken glass, or the
Yeah, yeah.
cestus from the from Pancration and the
Hmm?
Roman gladiatorial games. I think they used the cestus in Roman gladiatorial games. Anyway,
Yeah.
brass knuckles. It's we're still just trying to punch each other, but in one, I mean, with boxing, with the big gloves, you can hide behind your gloves. That's way harder to do in little 4-ounce MMA gloves, and it's
Yeah.
no solution at all if you're wearing brass knuckles.
For sure, the technique changes. Like, have you ever tried to punch with a pair of brass knuckles on?
I
I mean,
have
it
not.
doesn't actually
No,
cover the knuckles, it covers the fingers. And so if you try to throw like a straight right with power behind it, it can do as much damage to you as the other guy.
really.
If you,
I never
however,
thought
do,
about that. No.
yeah, if you, however, do like just a quick, short
Hammer
movement like
fist.
that, that would do nothing without the brass knuckles on, you can tear people apart with it. It's
So
a
what you
strange
actually need to
weapon.
do is practice on the speed bag with those
Yeah,
silly little hammer
almost
fists.
like the little
Yeah.
speed bag motions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's
the
so
equipment
interesting.
changes everything.
Yeah. Um, so where do you fall on this martial arts for the ring versus martial arts for the streets?
Mm.
Because this is such a fraught topic. I mean, a few years ago, you got in and I don't know, we'll call it an online beef with the infamous Master Wong.
Sure,
Uh,
yeah. For
he's
the
that
streets.
super hyper energetic, yeah, super hyper energetic Wing Chun guy
Hmm.
who's uh, basically shaved head. So it's the three shaved heads. Now two of us are talking about the third. Um, who had a whole bunch of self-defense based videos, and that was his claim, right? This is for the streets, and the streets are
Hmm.
so different from the sport. So what's your take on that dichotomy? Is it a true dichotomy? Is it a false
The
dichotomy?
the streets are way different than combat sports, but not for the reasons that the self-defense gurus are telling you. The self-defense gurus will use fear-mongering tactics and sell you a power fantasy that the streets are this place where anything goes, anything can happen. It's a war zone. You can just murder people and tear them to pieces, Mortal Kombat style, and it's all going to be good and fine. That's not true. Self defense is a legal term. It's not a martial art, it's not a fighting system. It's a legal term to justify violent action that would otherwise be illegal. And you have to do that in front of a judge. And if you cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that your violent actions were justifiable to defend yourself, to defend others, or defend your property, depending on the jurisdiction in which you live, it's not self defense. So, a lot of what Master Wong teaches, and I never, what I'm about to say, I haven't laid into Master Wong about this, haven't made a video specifically about Master Wong on this subject. I've just critiqued some of his techniques, like some bad rear naked choke videos where he left wide spaces open and so on. But what what Master Wong teaches you, like grab the guy by the nuts, tear them off, stick in his mouth, feed it to him, uh, you know, maim the guy in some way.
It's Master
It's
Ken, but for real.
yes, it's a guy like Master Ken, but he's not a parody. He's not an actor playing a character. If you somehow were able to do these things, if
Which
you're
you
somehow
probably
able to,
can't.
which you probably can't, yes, but if you can, let's just assume there's a guy with superhuman grip strength, goes out there, rips chunks of flesh off of somebody on the streets, and he stands before the judge. Well, Your Honor, it was absolutely necessary that I tore his face off, bit his ears from his head, and broke all of his limbs. It's how how do you justify that? You don't. You can't justify that. MMA is a similar situation because when people say things like, I want to train in MMA for self defense, it's often too much for some situations and too little for others. For example, if someone points a gun at you, they're standing 10 feet away because they're smart enough to understand this is a ranged weapon, and says, give me all your money or I will shoot you. MMA is not the solution. Master Wong is not the solution. None of that is the solution. The solution is do what the guy asks and walk away alive. If an
If a
unarmed
drunk uncle comes up to you
drunk
at a
uncle comes
barbecue,
up to you at the barbecue, yes, exactly, and
ripping
tries
his
to,
testicles off and putting them down his own throat, would
yes,
probably, even if the judge thought it was okay, the rest of your extended family would probably have a thing or two to say about it.
yes, that situation, that's too much. And
Oh,
MMA
but sorry, that
approach,
I picked the non-MMA example, but even an
yes,
MMA
even an
example,
MMA
double
approach, right?
leg, double leg takedown, past the guard, go to mount, pound him in the teeth, and then choke him unconscious.
Yeah,
Kind of a standard.
that's too
Too
much.
much.
So if we're teaching something like use the minimum necessary force to control the situation with the drunk uncle, maybe take him down and pin him, hold him there until he calms down. Cool. That that's reasonable in my estimation. But following that up with ground and pound and strangulation, probably not. So,
Well, the you brought up the legal ramifications, and of course they vary in the jurisdiction that you live. I
yes.
mean, if you eye gouge somebody in a stand your ground state versus in Canada, uh, that's a very different legal situation.
Yep.
Uh, so I think if you were training for self defense, cool. It would probably mostly look like MMA, but you would also have to address the legal aspects. You'd have to address weapons. You'd have to address, and this is hardly ever addressed, verbal de escalation tactics or other
Mm-hmm.
de escalation tactics. And practice them under pressure, which I think is really the ultimate gift that training judo or training jiu-jitsu or training in boxing or MMA gives you, is the ability to stay calm under pressure. Sure, somebody's in my face and there's a ton of aggression, or somebody's like pushing me up against a wall, but I have both of their hands controlled, and unless I'm ready for the headbutt, and it's just the fact that somebody's in your face, you got to pay attention, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. You don't have to go to DEFCON 12. So
Yeah.
I think that learning to handle aggression and pressure is a real gift. And then the technical aspects. Well, here's how I would strip a collar grip. Here's how I would defend against the headbutt. That's important, but that's secondary.
Yeah, for sure. I have a lot of conversations online with people trying to convince me that street fights are unavoidable. And when I talk to an older crowd, they tend to never get into street fights past a certain age. The guys who always get into street fights tend to be very young and hung up on the young man's ego. Now, there, of course, are exceptions, but,
And often drunk.
and often drunk, yeah. Yeah, I just talked to John Hackelman yesterday about the concept of self defense, and he said the number one thing he teaches, and again, this is a famous UFC trainer of fighters like Chuck Liddell and so on. He said the number one self defense tactic he teaches is don't get drunk.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with that. I support that completely. It's like, yes, that one tip solves so many problems, like 99% of these problems.
Well, it solves problems for let's just say male and female self-defense does
Mm.
look different. Certainly
Yes.
that addresses a large aspect of male self-defense.
Hmm.
Like if you're not drunk and you're not in a place where other people are drunk, because you could be stone cold sober and have somebody take a swing at you because they're full of liquid courage.
Hmm.
But for women, not getting drunk in public is certainly a good plan. But now we have to factor in things like Rohypnol and GHB and all the various date rape
Right.
drugs. I know they're chronically used in North America. I don't know if they've hit China yet, but they're
Mm.
tasteless, they're odorless, they're basically clear. And this is something I'm teaching my daughters, and close relatives of ours have been roofied.
Mm.
Fortunately, it didn't get any worse than that because their friends took them out. But just that was a super useful lesson for like never ever trust anyone with your drink. So
Mm.
the lessons around alcohol to women are similar but different to the lessons about alcohol to young boys of a certain age, as you called them.
Yeah. This brings up an interesting question I get a lot on my channel, which is essentially, should we make a distinction between men's and women's self-defense? And as you were talking about that, I thought, yeah, we should. As far as combative techniques, because people often conflate the term self-defense with combative techniques, maybe not as much, but the approach to teaching self-defense, absolutely, I think so.
What other aspects? How else would you change the teaching and sort of the strategy of deploying your techniques between a male group and a female group?
Well, this is a good question, especially for a guy like me who will adamantly tell people I am not a self-defense instructor. What I'm teaching you is not self-defense. I'm teaching
Hey, you
fighters to win
were
fights.
on the Ultimate
But
Self Defense Championships, which I want to talk
oh yeah,
about. So
okay,
you
well
are
we'll talk about that.
inextricably linked to that
Yeah,
to this now.
I suppose so. Um, but I have a number of students who are female, and they have no ambitions of being professional fighters. They just like to train. They want to learn jiu-jitsu. They want to build up confidence or whatever. I haven't interviewed or grilled them about their intentions behind training in MMA and jiu-jitsu, but I can clearly see because of strength differentials, size differentials, they cannot succeed with the same strategies as their larger, stronger male counterparts. And so, like anything, we have to focus on our strengths against our opponent's weaknesses. That's how we win the game of rock paper scissors that is mixed martial arts or any martial arts competition. So if you have a small woman with short arms who will probably never darce choke anybody, but has strong legs, then obviously a triangle choke is going to be a better option. And so building your game around that is going to be a um, a higher level game plan than say trying to execute a correct darce choke when your arms are extremely short.
Hmm.
Um, so when I started training in jiu-jitsu, I was often bombarded with this idea of everything works, everything in jiu-jitsu is magical. And when I would roll with really big, really strong guys, I found that simply wasn't true. I found that when there was like a 30% size and strength difference, a lot of the techniques in my arsenal became much less effective or completely useless. And I felt like maybe there's something wrong with my jujitsu. Maybe I'm just doing it wrong because everybody swears up and down these techniques work. And I remember hearing years later Eddie Bravo talking about this subject, talking about his rubber guard system. And he said, my rubber guard system works really well against people close to your same size. But as soon as there is like a 30% size and strength difference, you need to change your game plan. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm experiencing in my life here. And I was just married to the rubber guard back in the day. Like that was my thing. I won.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd won a couple of professional fights using using some 10th Planet stuff, and I was like, man, this stuff works. This is the best. But when I heard Eddie Bravo himself say that, it was like something clicked, and I was like, I need to expand my jujitsu to make it universally applicable to not just fighting a guy my same size and strength in a cage fight or a jujitsu match, but something that is much more universally applicable to everybody in every situation. In a cage fight, in a self-defense situation, should that ever happen,
Mhm.
in a teaching situation on the mat when there's a giant dude who shows up to the gym who wants to try out a class and he can deadlift half a ton and nobody can stop him because he's like a bull in a china shop. I want my jujitsu to be applicable in all those situations. And so I changed my approach. I changed my game plan. I changed the techniques I
What
used.
did you
Essentially,
change?
I got rid of a lot of stuff. I streamlined it.
For example?
Okay, let's take the rubber guard for example. Again, I enjoy the rubber guard. It's something I pull out of my toolbox once in a while to polish off. But that was one of the first things to go.
Mm,
And it's not because it doesn't work. It's just because I found other strategies that worked better. Specifically, be the guy on top. When you
mm,
play rubber guard, for example, you're essentially committing yourself to the bottom game. And there are situations where that might be wise, but there are a lot where it's not.
mhm.
And I found,
Especially if your focus is MMA.
yes,
Like, I think the meta has changed in MMA over the last 20 years that if you're on the bottom, there are ways to win, but
hmm,
overall, I don't know what the statistics are now, but I would imagine if you're on the bottom, you're going to lose
yeah.
more than 50% of your fights for sure.
And even if you
For
win,
sure.
you're going to take damage. You're going to take a
Yes.
substantial amount of damage playing any kind of guard game, closed guard, open guard, whatever. You're going to get hit. And it's it's funny when I started competing, when I started combat sports, professional combat sports, fighting, I got punched a lot, and I just assumed, well, this comes with the territory, and of course it does. You get in a fist fight, you're going to get punched, but there are ways to minimize that, and the best way to minimize that is not the best guard system. It's just fighting to be the guy on top. It's a
Mm.
simple thing. Essentially, I'm advocating wrestling for mixed martial arts here, wrestling for jujitsu. Become the best wrestler that you can on top of what you can already do, and that changes and it streamlines so many things in combat sports.
Well, we're seeing a trifurcation, if that's a word, a,
Hmm.
a, a splitting off into three different things in jiu-jitsu. We're seeing it, the jiu-jitsu with the gi,
Hmm.
jiu-jitsu without the gi, and jiu-jitsu for MMA. And I think at this point, there's no denying that they are different things. I think there was a time when a smart no-gi competitor would find gi competitors to train with. Because at the time, the highest level guys in the world were all training with the gi. So if you were doing this little niche no gi circuit, I don't know, Naga or whatever, or even fighting MMA, you'd still get a higher level of training going with the guys who are in the gi, even though it wasn't as sport specific. But I don't think that's
Hmm.
true anymore. I think now there are such high level guys and such high level teachers in each of those three areas that most of the time, your best strategy is to train just within that area or spend most of your time training within that area. And I think the exception would be the whole self defense thing because in
Hmm.
you're are you going to be attacked by somebody wearing a speedo? Are you
Hmm.
is your uncle going to be wearing a speedo or a coat and jeans? You don't know. So I think for
If you're at the
if
beach,
you've
it could
got
happen.
it could happen. Yeah, at the wrong beach, it could have only one handle um,
Hmm.
to uh, to hang on to. Um, but uh, yeah, I've seen this. We'll call it a trifurcation because it's a big fancy word. Do you think the same thing's happening over there in China, where there's such specialization?
Oh, that's a good question. As far as jujitsu right now,
Well,
hmm.
you see, you do you have high level MMA? Do you have high level gi jiu jitsu, and do you have high level no gi jiu jitsu?
To some extent, which is kind of weird because jujitsu is still fairly new in China. Like when
Mhm.
I arrived in Shanghai 16 years ago, the highest ranked individuals were two blue belts who started a gym called Shanghai Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's since grown and become a pretty respectable jiu-jitsu gym. But at the time, just two blue belts. And now there are all kinds of jiu-jitsu gyms, and there are guys like what's his name, Joseph Chen, who's
Yeah.
doing really well in the sport of MMA, coming out of Shanghai, or sorry, sport of jiu-jitsu, no-gi jiu-jitsu, coming out of Shanghai. And it's it's interesting to see that now, because a few years ago I've seen people in the combat sports community openly mocking Chinese combat sports, like, ah, nothing good will ever come out of China, and then, you know, that simply hasn't been the case.
Mhm.
China has the distinctive advantage of having an enormous number of people, and when you can throw enough people at the problem, you can solve problems pretty quickly. So even though we had a pretty rough start as far as combat sports here go, meaning nobody was doing it, then some people started doing it. Now a fairly sizable number of people are doing it. In the future, we could have an astronomical number of people doing it. So
How
I
did
don't
you
know.
convince people that they should be uh, cage fighting, essentially? How did you make, because this is such an obscure idea
Yeah.
if you haven't been raised on watching old Valley Tudo videos or the early UFCs. I mean, that's certainly in North America, probably yourself included,
Hmm.
triggered the movement. What was the changing thing in China? Was it things like the UFC being broadcast or indigenous
Yeah, that
MMA
certainly helped.
competitions?
That certainly helped. There was a time, my first year here in Shanghai, I saw a Chinese guy wearing a tap out shirt. Now, at that time in America, guys wearing tap out shirts had a reputation of being like, ah, that guy's a poser, whatever. But as soon as I saw the guy in the tap out shirt, I ran up to him and I said, "You know what MMA is?" And he was like, "Yes, I know what MMA is." And it was like, "You're the only other human I've met who understands." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone like you." Um, it's not that I convinced anybody to become interested in mixed martial arts. I offered it, I put it out there. There is something about ritual combat and mixed martial arts, boxing, jujitsu, all of this, it's a form of ritual combat. And a lot of animals engage in ritual combat. Lizards do it, monitor lizards. They do Greco Roman wrestling, basically. Little lizards like skinks, they do freestyle wrestling, they attack the legs. They're not trying to kill each other and they're not trying to hurt each other. They're trying to compete with each other for their place in the social hierarchy. You see rams and deer and these creatures with antlers go at it and they wrestle with their antlers or their horns, or they butt heads. It's ritual combat. Again, they're not trying to kill each other. They're engaging in this instinctive animal act to establish a place in the social hierarchy. And our modern society tends to divorce us from the concept of ritual combat. We tend to see it as barbaric. And in the animal world, the role of ritual combat is to offer an outlet for aggression, but nobody has to die. It's a fight to the death, but nobody has to die. It's like a vicarious sacrifice, like a vicarious blood sacrifice from an ancient culture, but nobody has to die, if you will. It's like a way to express our animal instinct without murder. And there's something beautiful and transcendent and important about that. And everybody, to some extent, feels it. And this is why so many people become drawn to martial arts combat sports, jiu-jitsu in particular, in the modern world, because it gives us an outlet for regular ritual combat, even in the practice room, when we roll, when we spar. It gives us a chance to have to vent that animal instinct inside of us in a very unique way that has been missing from our culture and our civilization for a very long time.
It's interesting. I've had a couple of new cats come into the house recently, so fairly young
Mm,
cats, and to watch them fight. And again, like you said, they're not trying to murder each other. I think get a little bit heated sometimes, but most of the time it's fairly friendly. And for all these people who are like, you'd never pull guard in the streets. These cats are pulling guard all the time. In fact, their strategies are
mm,
to pull inverted guard. And so they
mm.
can basically reach up with their back claws and claw. It's
I've seen this.
oh, wait a second, that's an Imanari roll. Oh, that's the cat is just pulling inverted guard. And
Mm,
uh, and I imagine in addition to um, venting energy and doing this primal thing, they're also training
hmm.
because maybe they go outside one day and a coyote comes, or maybe they
Yeah,
go outside one day and a bigger, meaner cat or a raccoon that wants to eat them comes, and it, you know, there is an aspect. Or when two bear
yeah,
cubs fight, they're not trying to kill each other, but when that bear cub grows up into a bear mama, and a bigger bear comes and tries to eat its cubs, that
yeah.
bear mama has it's not her first rodeo. It's not her first
Yeah,
fight.
for
It's a
sure. And that
plaything.
is the evolutionary advantage of ritual combat. It keeps us sharp. And like I said before, it establishes our place in the social hierarchy. And as far as bears are concerned, the social hierarchy is are you big and strong enough to survive in the wilderness when there are threats that require actual combat?
Hmm.
So, yeah, for sure. Sure.
So Ramsey, you've trained karate, you've trained kickboxing, you've trained Muay Thai, you do a ton of MMA. What do you think about training with headgear when you're sparring?
I hate it. I hate it personally, and I hate it professionally for several reasons. Personally, I'm visually impaired, so headgear cuts off my peripherals, and that's how I see. Like, I've got a blind spot in the center. That's from my last professional fight. My opponent broke my skull. He had loaded wraps, left me partially blind. So I operate primarily with my peripheral vision. So headgear again takes away my vision. Now professionally, I hate it. I don't recommend it for fighters, with very few exceptions. Headgear protects your skin. It protects the soft tissue on the outside of your face. It will help prevent black eyes, cuts, abrasions. That's about it. It does nothing to protect your brain. But the great disservice that is sold to martial artists and combat sports practitioners is that headgear makes um, sparring safer for your brain. It reduces brain damage. This is not true. In fact, in many cases, I believe it exacerbates the problem. Like, even in Olympic
Explain.
boxing, headgear is being abolished because they figured this out. However, many combat sports practitioners still have not. Now, if you are sparring with elbows, for example, headgear can help prevent cuts because an elbow, it's bone on bone contact with a thin layer of skin in between. That's going to open up cuts. Okay, fine. If that's why you're wearing headgear, cool. Elbow pads, on the other hand, I think are probably a better solution for that specific scenario because if you're training for Muay Thai, any kind of clinch work, a collar tie, is going to shift the headgear around. It's going to move it around. It's going to make the back of it go over your face. You can't breathe or see. You have to stop and reset every few seconds. So I would say most applications of headgear are not good ones. The way it's used by most combat sports practitioners. Now, when you have a headgear with an extra covering like a mask over it, I think this exacerbates the problem even more because it creates an illusion of safety. The illusion, the security theater of the mask is that, oh, I won't break my nose, this is safer, I won't get my teeth punched out. What will happen is now your face is this much closer to your opponent's fists, and when you get hit, it is going to bounce your head back even more. There's extra weight on your head. Headgear can weigh several pounds depending on the type. If you've got a light one versus a heavy one, and Most of the major brands like Fairtex, for example, those are heavier headgear. Those weigh like 2 or 3 pounds, which might not seem like a lot, but you add that weight to your head, and then you get hit, and then your head goes flying back. What what causes a knockout, a concussion, what causes most brain damage in combat sports is the brain bouncing around against the skull in this sack of water inside your skull. And when you get punched and the head moves, the brain moves with it. When the head stops moving, the brain keeps going in that sack of water and crashes against the skull. Headgear doesn't solve that problem. I've had a lot of people try to argue this point with me and pull out physics equations and whatnot. No, actually, 2 centimeters of foam will save you. And I don't buy it. That has not been my experience. With almost every professional fighter that I know who is trained with and without headgear, they will almost universally say, I prefer to spar without the headgear. For two main reasons. One, visual, just like me, even if they're not visually impaired, they prefer to have their peripherals, because this is how we see motion. Like in a fight, we can't focus on details. If you're looking at what color the guy's eyes are or the shape of his nose, you're losing the fight. If you are sensing the motion, seeing the motion through your peripherals, which is how humans sense motion, you're doing the right thing. So, for example, if you look at the box of the body, you'll be able to see the arms and the legs and the hips and the shoulders move before they get to you. If you're focusing on details, you won't. And that all comes from peripheral vision, which headgear, again, it obstructs. It's like putting blinders on. And secondly, the second thing professional fighters say is when I wear headgear, one, people always spar harder because they think it makes them safer. And two, I always end up with a headache afterward that I don't get when sparring without the headgear. So it creates more problems than it solves.
Okay. So then how can one spar with
Mm.
contact in a way to minimize brain damage? Because
Ah,
honestly, it's the brain damage and the knowledge, the certain knowledge that these athletes who are competing for my pleasure in the UFC or in the boxing ring are inflicting brain damage. They are receiving and inflicting brain damage. This is actually a. I recognize that they've consented to this,
mm,
but it makes it harder for me to enjoy it, and it makes
hmm
it harder for me to endorse it as a practical training that everybody should do.
yeah,
Of course, like boxing is a very, very effective martial art, but the brain damage that comes hand in glove with it is difficult to justify sometimes.
yeah, for sure. And even as a coach, I don't want to see my fighters get messed up. I don't want to see them have the injuries I had, and I don't want to see them have injuries that other fighters have had. And I definitely don't want to see them die in the ring. One of my former opponents ended up dying in the ring in a later fight, and that was that was a very sobering experience when I heard about that.
Was that in boxing or MMA?
Yeah, it was a kickboxing match,
Okay.
so
Was it brain
becoming
damage or was it brain damage or was it like a
I
ruptured
assume it
spleen
was
or
just
something?
cumulative brain damage from too
Okay,
many hits to the head. I don't have all the details. I
sure.
just heard that he died after the fight. He was taken to a hospital,
Okay.
and yeah, there's
So
we
how do
have
you
to make
minimize it in
assumptions with that.
training?
Okay, we have to become a good sparring partner, but that is a unique skill set. Like learning how to fight is one skill set. Learning to become a safe sparring partner is a different and equally important skill set. And to become a good fighter, like a truly exceptional fighter, we must become an effective and safe training partner as well. So if you go and spar at the UFC Performance Institute, for example, before every sparring session, they will always remind the fighters, and most of these fighters come from a Sanda background where their sparring is fairly moderate. Like it's not intense, they're not gym fights, basically. But they still remind the fighters go very light to the head. You can use more power to the body or legs, but go very light to the head. They're always reminding them of this. And I would say most of the guys over the PI are great training partners. Like I well, before the knee injury, I would go and spar with those guys as often as I could, and it was always a great experience. I loved it. Um, I felt more safe sparring at the UFC Performance Institute than I do at most gyms,
Mm.
and that might shock a lot of people. You're
Ironic, isn't it?
sparring with these professional fighters. Like I step in the ring with Li Jingliang, for example, when he's training for his fight with Khamzat Chimaev, and and most people would expect to get annihilated by this top 10 welterweight. And he's a good training partner. He's a really good training partner. Like he's a guy I would love to spar with on a regular basis, because it's enjoyable, it's fun, it's constructive. We're learning something. Now obviously he didn't win that fight, but he's a phenomenal fighter. um but becoming that kind of training partner takes time, and it takes patience, and you have to work toward it. I had a student, a new student, and he was a big, strong guy from an Eastern European country. Where was he from? Blanking on his home country. Anyway, this guy had a young man's ego, and he came to my. I was teaching a boxing class at the time, and he kept saying, when we're doing these light drills, these light skill drills, when can I just step in the ring and punch somebody? And he kept pushing this issue, and I said, all right, you want to get in the ring and punch somebody? All right, here's one of my fighters. And I tell my fighter, blast him a few times. Let him know what's up. They spend about 30 seconds in the ring. You gets blasted a few times, calls a timeout. He's like, okay, I get it. I'm not ready for that. Sometimes violence can solve a problem like that
Yeah.
pretty quickly. Sometimes it can escalate it. So as a coach, you have to use your best
Yeah.
judgment. And it's a judgment of character, not a judgment of fighting skill, but a judgment of psychology. How is this person going to respond to violence?
Mm. And emphasizes the role of the coach in keeping the sparring safe and keeping everyone to the initial rules that were agreed to or that were laid down, you know,
Yeah,
before ego and hurt feelings allow the whole damn thing to escalate wildly.
yeah. If you can establish a gym culture of, in this gym we spar like this, and a new guy comes in, he sees how everybody spars, it's pretty easy for them to pick up the vibe.
Mm.
Okay, in this gym we spar like this. In this gym we go light to the head, technical. We're trying to learn something. We're not fighting in the gym. It's sparring. It's different. Okay. People learn through actions rather than words. You can tell people. This is why I hate it when I go to a gym and they say, "All right, guys, we're only sparring at 50% today." What does that mean? I can punch through bricks. I I can punch through boards. I can hit really hard. 50% of that. Okay, instead of breaking 4 bricks worth of power, it's breaking 2 bricks worth of power, right?
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah.
Because when you tell,
Instead of giving somebody a concussion with one punch, I'll have to hit them twice.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you tell young men with that young man's ego, and every young man thinks he knows how to fight and thinks he can punch really hard, only 50%, they're like, that's still pretty hard in my estimation, because I'm a tough guy, right? I never tell people spar at a percentage of power. I always tell them the expectations go light, and I'll give them an example. I'll say hit them this hard, and I'll tag them on the body or tag them on the cheek, and they'll be like, oh, that wasn't hard at all. Okay, I get it. I understand the level of power I'm supposed to spar at. And we rarely have problems. So a coach has to lead by example, and it takes a considerable amount of time to develop this skill set. An exercise I sometimes have newer students do is hit the heavy bag as hard as you can, like a normal person, and then hit the heavy bag as fast as you can, but with as little contact. And they get a little confused about that, and they're like, okay, they're trying to go fast, but as little contact, as little power as possible. Like touch the skin of the heavy bag, but not the filling, which is a way that some of my old Taekwondo instructors used to spar. Touch the skin of your sparring partner, but not the muscle, and definitely not the bone. If you're reaching the bone, that's too far. So that's my take on light sparring. Keep it light, keep it technical, and make sure you're learning something every single time as far as striking goes, especially when they're striking to the head. You can do it safely to the point where you can do it every day. You don't have to be repeatedly hit in the head over and over and over again to understand what a punch feels like. But considering how many people argue this point with me on YouTube, it feels like sometimes we need to bash them over the head with this knowledge over and over again.
Well, I mean, in YouTube, you're dealing with many, many, many experts who live in their mom's basement and have never broken a sweat in their life. So that's just what I
Mm.
have to remind myself of at a regular basis. And I hope this revelation that you didn't know before helps you find peace with the YouTube commentary at. So this is kind of a big question, and uh, what is living in China like as a
Oh,
foreigner? I mean, I've talked to many expats, and they all have living in China, and they all have very different experiences. So, what's your day to day like, and how's it? Do you
okay.
yearn for any aspects of home?
Oh man. I think living in China is really cool. I really enjoy it, which is why I've stayed here for 16 years. And I've met lots of expats who have very different experiences than mine, who absolutely hate everything about the Chinese experience. Where you live in China is going to make a massive difference. Here in Shanghai, there are so many foreigners. People are accustomed to seeing foreigners, so nobody really bats an eye. Once in a while, a little kid will look at me and say, "Look, Daddy, it's a foreigner." And but that's about it. If you go to the far reaches of China, like a small town in Inner Mongolia, you'll have a very different experience. For example, when my family and I were traveling through Inner Mongolia, every 5 minutes, the locals would stop us and say, "Oh, look, foreigners, can we take pictures with you?" Like we were famous celebrities or something. And my kids, they were rolling their eyes like, "Oh man, another picture? What the heck? I'm just a person. Leave me alone." So I think my kids are having a radically different experience being born and raised in China than I'm having as an expat living in China. So I'm now interested to have this conversation with them. What is it like living in China? They don't know any
Mm.
different though, because this is their home, always has been. But I enjoy Shanghai a lot. Shanghai is a huge city. It's the largest city in China. It is a concrete jungle. There is
Like
you can
20
find
million people or something?
about 27 million people.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the official population right now, I believe. They're including immigrants because there is a massive influx of migrant workers who travel from other provinces to Shanghai, and then every Chinese New Year there's a mass exodus and then they return. Like the train stations get insane around Chinese New Year. So we could have at any given time over 30 million people in this city. But the official population is like 27 million. It's massive, massive and sprawling. But because of that, you can find anything, anything you're looking for, you can find it in Shanghai. You want, take for example, you want to eat Italian food. Great, you've got a litany of amazing Italian restaurants. You want to learn jujitsu? You can go learn jujitsu because that exists now. Um, Name it, you can probably find it. So there isn't much I yearn for from home except for the emptiness.
Mm.
Because I grew up out in a very small rural farming community where you take 2 steps out of your backyard and you are in open farmland. And there are more cows than people. People still ride horses around town sometimes. There are it's I think the main thing that's missing, besides the complete lack of people in the rural area, and this could lead into a completely different discussion, but it's religion. Like China is an officially atheist country. I'm a person of faith, and China has very limited freedom of religious expression. There's freedom of religious practice, meaning you can believe whatever you want to believe, but cannot do whatever you want to do, if that makes sense. So basically, there are like,
No.
I think 40 million registered Christians in China. And that term registered Christian is an interesting thing because in order to legally operate a church, for example, you must have express permission from the government. Anyway, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but the more I live in China, the more I realize how incredibly blessed people are who live in countries with religious freedom, even atheists, because they have the power to choose for themselves what they will believe and how they will act. And while China does a lot of great things, they do a lot of things right. Again, that's definitely one thing that I miss. Um, I just visited the what is it called? The Buddhist temple up in Inner Mongolia. I'm trying to remember the specific name of it. Um,
Did you post pictures of it on your Instagram? I thought I saw pictures of you at a temple recently.
that was probably a different temple, but this one was
Okay.
interesting. It's a lamastery, a Tibetan style lamastery, because essentially they Tibetan lamas moved up to Inner Mongolia and brought their brand of Buddhism up there. Anyway, I was so fascinated when I went up there because at first I was like, oh, I'm a tourist here, I'm taking pictures, and then I saw people like actual pilgrims, religious pilgrims, Buddhist pilgrims going there having an authentic religious experience and praying, and I'm like, this is really cool because I it is the rare exception to see an expression of religious faith in China. It's not my particular faith, but it's like something about that really resonated with me. Like this is really cool because this is so rare to see here. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
it made me appreciate that aspect of America, the religious freedom aspect of America, to believe or not believe, however you see fit. Anyway, that's the I would say that's the main thing that I miss about home.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I can empathize with the need for open space, having just come back from a 19-day, 800-kilometer trip through the Arctic and not seeing anybody for it just those kinds of wide open spaces don't exist everywhere in the world, and
Yeah,
we're really quite lucky to have them in parts of North America, and I don't know, maybe Antarctica,
yeah,
or inner Australia, the middle of Australia. You might be able to pull that off. I,
I
I
would.
I can't let you go without talking about the self defense championships.
Okay, yes,
Uh,
let's discuss
that
that.
so a friend of the podcast, Rokas Leo,
Hmm.
a couple of years ago, put out the Ultimate Self Defense Championship. Can you describe what it was and what your experience of it was, and if you learned anything during it?
Hmm. Okay. Wow. So essentially, it's a reality show, and none of us really knew what to expect going in. We just knew Rokas from YouTube. Seems like a pretty nice guy. Like, hey, come do this thing, and we're like, oh, all right, sure. Sounds like a good time. Let's go. I think we all had this idea. We were going to go make some fun YouTube videos together, have a neat YouTuber collaboration, and maybe do some self defense related activities. And then we get there and we are getting sucker punched and throttled and all kinds of crazy things are being thrown at us largely by surprise.
So it
And
was a series of scenarios that you'd all be in, and you didn't know exactly what the parameters were, but you had to resolve them somehow.
yeah, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that. So the very this was this came at a weird time in my life for me because like right before this, Shanghai had this unprecedented lockdown. Like the entire city was locked down for 3 months. And by lockdown, I mean nobody in the entire city was able to leave their homes. Nobody was able to
Yeah.
get food or potable water or anything like that that wasn't shipped to them by the government. And there was some very
People
uneven
talk about
distribution of
lockdowns here in
resources.
North America, but it was nothing compared to the lockdowns in China.
Yeah, so after 3 months of this, and again, there was some tremendous human suffering. And if anybody
Yeah.
tested positive for COVID, they're sent off to a concentration camp. If anybody is a close contact of somebody who has COVID, they're sent off to a concentration camp for the duration of the lockdown. If anybody is a close contact of a close contact, they
Yeah.
get sent off to one of the, so entire apartment complexes were sent off to these camps because like one person tested positive. And it was a mess. It was a mess. My family, for the most part, we were okay. We had a food storage. That's something we do. We did run very low on potable water because again, the tap water in Shanghai is not potable. Um, so it was not a great situation. Anyway, eventually the government says, "All right, fine, we'll let you all out, but you're all going to get COVID," and we did. We all got COVID, and but hard, man. I got it bad. So I went into the Ultimate Self Defense Championship recovering from COVID. like, it was rough, man. It was rough. So anyway, we get there, and I'd
How
gone
long
two
had you had
days.
COVID before the competition or before the?
Oh man, I was sick for about 2 months.
Yeah.
I was bedridden for about 2 months. I lost about 30 pounds of body weight. Um, Again, it was rough. I was having a hard
Yeah.
time just staying on my feet. But you know, I was like, it won't be so bad. You know, it's just some fun YouTube video thing. Anyway, so we get there. I hadn't slept in 2 days. I can't sleep on a plane. We go to a beach and we do like a group sumo wrestling thing, and it's kind of like a fun little game. And I'm thinking, okay, this is obviously setting the tone for the whole competition. It's going to be fun and games. All right, cool. We can deal with this. And then the very next day we get ambushed. So, um we're we're going to spar on a bus and we put on all this protective equipment, which I think is kind of a terrible idea because it changes the metric of everything like we were discussing before. As soon
Mhm.
as you change one piece of equipment, it's a different sport. It's a different thing. But we put on all these pads, we go on the bus, and we're told to do very light sparring. We're told to do very light, friendly sparring on the bus.
Sure, sure. Let's go light. The first, last, and ultimate lie of every training session. Go ahead.
Yes. Now, we weren't sparring with each other so much as we were sparring with the bus because the bus driver is popping wheelies and turning circles and trying to throw us all over the place with the centrifugal motion of the turns. And it was incredibly random. And this whole time I'm thinking, what does this have to do with self defense? I'm not defending myself against Icy Mike and Sensei Seth and Jeff Chan and the other guys. I'm defending myself against the bus. Like, we need to stop sparring, grab a hold of something, sit down, and fasten our seatbelts. If this bus only had seatbelts, that would be the appropriate thing to do in this situation for self defense. But the show had to go on, presumably. So we do our we finish the light sparring and then we're told, okay, go to the back of the bus. We need some B-roll, you know, just let's take some pictures for YouTube. So we're out there posing in the back of the bus. And then this small army of screaming Australian rugby player looking guys run into the bus and start legitimately trying to hurt us. Legitimately trying to throw like damaging punches. I think Sensei Seth ended up taking the brunt of the force because he was at the front of the bus and he just got smacked upside the head. And then afterward, I could tell like this was affecting Seth like mentally a lot. He was like, "What the heck, man? This is not what I signed up for. Is this what the rest of this week is going to be like?" And that left a really bad taste in my mouth, to be honest. Um, Again, I felt like the entire time, I felt like I needed to defend myself against the Western Combative School participants more so than play any of the games, if that makes any sense. So we have these self-defense themed games, and some of them I thought were I I struggle to see what a lot of these scenarios have to do with practical self-defense, to be honest. Um,
For example?
well, the bus, for example,
Okay, sure.
getting in a fight on a vehicle that is wildly out of control, driving in a dangerous way. I mean, can you think a of the practicality of that for real world self-defense?
No, I can think of it for real life YouTube.
Yeah,
Like
it
it's
makes
good.
great television.
No.
It makes great television. Now, let me see. The second event, I think they called it the circle drill. They basically ask us to close our eyes, stand in the middle of the room, and the instructions I heard was wait for the guy to get a position on you, and then fight back. And I think the first guy comes out, he grabs me around the waist, puts me on the floor. I'm like, okay, he's got the position. Let's fight back. And so um, this was going along fine. I'm like, okay, whatever. But then I just got sucker punched right in the face. I'm standing there with my eyes closed, counting down to 5 like they told me to, and I was expressly told what is not going to happen. This is a direct quote from Jeff Phillips, the director of that school. What is not going to happen is nobody is going to hit you when your eyes are closed. This exact thing happens. The guy just blasts me in the face while my eyes are closed, while my hands are down. I'm like,
Mhm.
what the heck, man? This is not cool. Anyway, so that also left a bad taste in my mouth. When you This is a weird situation. I did a few reviews of this show on my YouTube channel because my viewers were asking for it, and I gave some opinions and so on. But the question that I haven't really been able to answer is this a competition? Like, is this a legitimate competition, or is this a an exercise in self defense? Because we can't do both. Because once we gamify something, then you can game the system.
Yeah.
Take, for example, they did a
Just as a small change in equipment changes the game, a small change in rules changes the game.
yes. So ex post facto, I thought of all kinds of ways to gamify the system and exploit the loopholes in the rules. For example, we did that exercise. A lot of self defense schools do it, where you have a magic marker representing a knife, and you wear a
Mm.
T-shirt, and the knife guy tries to get marks on as many marks on the T-shirt as you can, and you try to stop them from doing that. So we do these 20-second goes, and I actually had a serious knee injury. Like it's been bothering me every day for the last year. I'm gonna end up needing a total knee replacement because of it, unfortunately. Um, so this knife situation and the event that preceded it, that was the culprit. But anyway, I might talk about that a bit later. But the knife stabby situation, I realized ex post facto this is a really easy game to milk the rules. You have a bunch of guys, they're not familiar with grappling or passing guard or anything like that. Their only goal is get marks on your t-shirt. Nothing else counts. If they got marks on your legs, your head, whatever, it doesn't count. Just the t-shirt. Why not pull open guard and just keep your legs between you and them the whole time? They wouldn't know what to do. Now, you could dominate the sport of knifey, knifey, stabby, stabby with the magic marker with that strategy. In a real life self defense situation, someone has a knife, you do that, you're going to get cuts all over your legs, and maybe that's better than getting stabbed in the heart or in the neck. But it's still not the optimal strategy. So, again, anytime we gamify something, we completely separate it
Yeah.
from self defense. It's like take modern sport karate with light or medium contact to the body and no punches to the head, but kicks to the head are okay for some reason. And it can be a fun sport. A lot of people enjoy that. I've competed in that particular sport as well in the past. However, is that representative of karate for self-defense? Maybe not. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily an ideal approach to a self-defense situation. But that's essentially what happens when we gamify it. So, yeah, what observations did you have about the Ultimate Self-Defense Championship from your perspective?
Well, it was fascinating to watch, and it was fascinating to watch people try and, I guess, in retrospect, figure out how to do self defense and how to game the system
Hmm.
at the same time. The, I mean, pretty much everyone there had some kind of background in pressure tested techniques, right? Training against resistance. I think it would have been kind of like a sharks and goldfish
Hmm.
situation to throw I don't know, a traditional Hungar stylist in there
Hmm.
who's been doing nothing but tiger crane form for 5 years and is really great at doing the tiger crane form. I mean, I guess that was kind of done in the early UFCs, right? That was all. I mean, there are rules in the UFC that have evolved over the years that drive the sport one way or drive the sport the other way. Um, and maybe any one game in isolation might not be useful or representative, but having lots of games where there's a slightly different rule set, slightly different tool set, and there's pressure being applied, maybe that is a legitimate way to move towards better self defense. Whether you should be filming it or not and turning it into a
Hmm.
show, that's a different question. Um, so I'm glad it exists. I'm really sorry about your knee.
Yeah, man,
Is
it
there?
was.
I mean, if you can hang on, I mean, there might be some amazing, amazing cartilage regeneration techniques coming in the next few years. This is being
Hopefully,
worked
because
on.
I've
We can
got
thank the
no
boomers.
cartilage left in my knee now.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we can thank the boomers for coming ahead of us, and they're all wearing out. So, I mean, I had my hip done not that long ago,
yeah.
and I'm glad that I had 50 years of boomers having hips. Well, boomers and before that, having hips done and the technology being refined on them. And then, it was a pretty easy recovery, and I'm back to almost everything that I normally
Hmm.
do. So,
Oh, that's
uh,
awesome, man. That
but
that gives me some
yeah,
hope, man. Because honestly, this has been a really depressing last year of dealing with these knee issues. Um.
this is getting way outside of topic, but
Yeah.
when I had my hip, they can take this needle. This needle is like 12 inches long. It's for the hip. They put it in the
Okay.
middle of your thigh and they inject it into the hip, and they inject like a viscous gel. It's
So like a
monovisc or
cortisone shot or
synvisc.
something else.
You can mix cortisone in with it, but it's actually a gelatinous thing that attracts water. So
Hmm.
it puts a bit of space into there. And I believe you can do the same with knees. It's not a long term solution. I think for knees, they mostly use something called
Hmm.
MONOVISC, VISC. And again, it just puts a little bit of cushioning in there, puts a little bit of space between the bones grinding on it. And
Interesting.
between that and the occasional cortisone shot, which I only had two, maybe, I I was able to keep going for a couple of extra years, but also go into the surgery fairly strong because I
Hmm.
could do the weightlifting that I could and the adductor and abductor strengthening and the flexor strengthening that I had to do, so that certainly the surgery knocks you back, but hopefully if you're starting not completely crippled, a lot of
Yeah.
people say, man, I wish I'd had it earlier, because
Hmm.
by the time they get there, they're so crippled they don't have any muscle mass left. So that's what everybody
Yeah.
said about a hip.
I
So I had
watched
it
your
earlier.
video on the prehab for the surgery. I thought that was really,
Mm.
really interesting. Um,
It helped for sure.
yeah.
And now
Wow.
it's a good incentive to lift weights for the rest of my life just to keep it tight, right? Um, I recently helped somebody who had dislocated their hip on a boat. It's like we had to get them off the boat, and it was a very complicated task. And the whole time I'm like, I feel so bad for you. I'm the only person here who can identify with what you're going through, but I need to keep this area tight. Um, I'm gonna let you go. Uh,
Okay.
where do people find you? Where do people find you're very prolific on YouTube. Congratulations. It's really quite a body of knowledge that you've built there. So,
Well, thank you.
how do people find you, and how do people train with you if they're in China?
Sure. Well, you can find me on the internet. Look up my name, Ramsey Dewey. I'm on the Ramsey Dewey channel on YouTube. I've got an Instagram. I post there once in a while. I've got a Facebook. It's all eponymous, Ramsey Dewey. If you want to find me in China, I'm in Shanghai. I'm currently coaching at two different gyms, the Mordor Fight Club and the Extreme Fight Lab, or the EFL gym. So if you Google me, just Google my name, you'll find my website with links to that. And yeah, come train.
Ask and thou shalt receive. Um,
Awesome.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I hope
Likewise.
your knee situation gets sorted out. I'm sure it will.